Thanksgiving is a time of year when people sit in reflection upon wonderful memories of days gone by. It is a time of rejoicing, of celebration, of reestablishing the bonds of friendship and family. It is the pinnacle of our autumnal consciousness. But it is also a time when the specters and phantoms of the past emerge to dance as vague shadows along the stones of the amber-lit hearth, to flit as tattered shades through the dark, crisp November air. Blackwater Media presents A Haunted Thanksgiving. I thought that going to college right out of high school was intimidating. I came from a small town, went to a huge college with an enrollment of over 50,000 students. It was crazy to me how active the campus was all the time. If I thought it was a culture shock, though, it was nothing compared to what happened during Thanksgiving break. Now, I didn't have the kind of money to be able to go home, so I remained in my dorm room alone during the break. I didn't realize that this also had me one of the few people, not only alone in the dorm building, but on the entire campus. What had so recently been just a metropolis of people became a barren wasteland. If the loneliness wasn't enough, a damn snowstorm hit the night before Thanksgiving. I recall waking up in the morning about 7 a.m. and looking out across a completely barren and desolate campus. Now, I suppose this doesn't seem weird at all, but it was a complete shock to me. Honestly, I spent the entire day on Wednesday in my dorm room looking out over the campus. I didn't really even have the nerve to go out. However, I guess I began getting stir crazy on Thanksgiving. I got myself a frozen turkey dinner that I was going to make in my microwave, but I really wanted to get out. Now, there was a Denny's on campus, so I thought I'd go there and have dinner. The dinner went fine, but I was uneasy because there was another guy in the restaurant who wouldn't stop staring at me. And I was like, what the fuck? It made me uncomfortable. I normally like to take my time in a restaurant, but couldn't bring myself to do that here. So immediately after I was done, I was up and out. Walking home, I nervously kept looking over my shoulder. It didn't take long before I noticed that the guy was following me. Holy shit. And he was walking faster than I was. By the time I got to the dormitory doorway, he was already up the front steps. He called for me to hold the door for him, but I didn't. He seemed pretty old for a person living in the dorms, but if he was a student, he'd have an electronic key card to let him in. I looked back as I went up the stairs and saw him standing in the foyer. Now, I'm not sure how much later it was, but I heard a knocking on my door. I got up and looked out the peephole and was surprised to see the man from outside standing in front of my door. I wasn't quite sure how he'd gotten in, nor how he found my room. Rather than acknowledge him, however, I went back to my desk quietly. He knocked a few more times and then left. About 5 hours later, I heard another knock at the door. At first, I of course expected it to be that man again. However, when I looked at the peephole, it was the campus police, and I let them in. One of the other students that was in my dorm building had gotten attacked earlier in the day, and they wanted to know if I'd seen anything suspicious. I explained my experience to them. They had arrested a suspect, and I had to go with them to see if I could identify the person. It indeed was the man who had followed me home from Denny's. He apparently had gone door to door knocking and hadn't known where I was. He eventually came across someone who opened their door, and the person who did paid a terrible, terrible price. Every Thanksgiving, twin brothers Bill and Frank Watson used to hear a ghost story from their grandfather. A former railroad worker, their grandpa would retell this spooky story of a place known as Duffy's Cut, located in Pennsylvania. In 1909, a man was walking home from a tavern. There he saw blue and green ghosts dancing in the mist on one September night. The Pennsylvania Railroad kept a record of this incident too. The man said, "I saw with my own eyes the ghosts of the Irishmen who died with the cholera a month ago, dancing around the big trench where they were buried. It's true, mister, and it was awful. Why, they looked as if they were kind of green and blue fire, and they were hopping and bobbing on their graves. I heard that the Irishmen were haunting the place because they were buried without the benefit of clergy." After their grandpa died, the Watson twins inherited his old railroad papers. Turns out their grandpa was the assistant to Martin Clement, the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. From there, they were shocked to find so many correspondences with the blue and green ghosts in the area. According to Frank, one of the correspondences said, "X marks the spot." Basically, the twins believed that perhaps there was a mass burial ground created when the landfill was made. This area was also the site of the original railroad bridge. An old witch was dead, and his people buried him in a tree up among the branches in a grove that they used for a burial place. Sometime after this, in the winter, an Indian and his wife came along looking for a good place to spend the night. They saw the grove, went in, and built their cooking fire. When their supper was over, the woman, looking up, saw long, dark things hanging among the tree branches. "What are they?" she asked. "They are only the dead of long ago," said her husband. "I want to sleep." "I don't like this at all. I think we'd better sit up all night," replied his wife. The man would not listen to her, but went to sleep. Soon the fire went out, and then she began to hear a gnawing sound like an animal with a bone. She sat still, very much scared, all night long. About dawn, she could stand it no longer, and reaching out tried to wake her husband, but she could not. She thought him sound asleep. The gnawing had stopped. When daylight came, she went to her husband and found him dead, with his left side gnawed away, and his heart gone. She turned and ran. At last she came to a lodge where there were some people. Here she told her story, but they would not believe it, thinking that she had killed the man himself. They went with her to the place, however. There they found the man with his heart gone, lying under the burial tree with the dead witch right overhead. They took the body down and unwrapped it. The mouth and face were covered with fresh blood. This is a weird story that happened to me back when I was a teenager. My grandparents had a really small farm located in a small hollow. It wasn't a commercial farm, just something they had to support themselves. However, when they got older, and it was more difficult for them to maintain the farm, they quit using the barn. It just sort of sat there and was used as a storage area mainly. Every Thanksgiving and Christmas, we would go out to our grandparents' house. Now, this story took place on Thanksgiving. I was 15 years old, and that's the age where I began not enjoying hanging out with the adults in my family anymore. Suddenly, listening to the stories of when I was a kid or when my parents were kids was just not that entertaining anymore. We had Thanksgiving dinner early. It was about 2 p.m. Afterward, I was beginning to feel a bit antsy. I let my parents know that I was going to go and explore the hollow a bit. It'd been a while since I'd done so. I didn't even think of asking my younger brother and sister if they wanted to go. It was fine because honestly, I felt like being by myself. I knew that I really didn't have a lot of time to explore before it got dark. So I set out and made sure I knew how far I could go and still get back before the sun had gone down. I didn't do the greatest job of it though. If you've ever been out exploring the woods, you might probably know what I mean. You can easily get fascinated with the woods and the hills and lose track of time. It got very, very dark before I was anywhere close to being home. By the time I got to the farm, it had been dark for at least an hour. I'd never been out by the barn when it was dark outside. It looked incredibly creepy. Now, being a teenage boy, I of course liked scary things. The thought then occurred to me that if the barn was creepy looking on the outside, it must be creepy as hell on the inside, and I decided to check it out. Now, getting into the barn was simple. My grandparents rarely locked the door of their house, much less about locking the barn. They lived in a really safe area where crime was pretty much unheard of. The barn did have one of those heavy wooden locks on it. There's a name for it, but I forget what it's called. I was surprised that I was able to get the door open at all. I figured that the hinges had to be nearly rusted shut. So as I mentioned, the barn was old. And even when it was in use, my grandparents would only have been in it during the day. So there was no light. Thank God that I lived in the era of smartphones though, because I of course had a flashlight on my smartphone. I turned on the flashlight and just marveled at the creepiness. You know, if dark is creepy, then just a minor amount of light is that much creepier. I was fascinated by all the tools. So many sharp implements. Most of them were hanging up. However, there was a small hatchet lying on a workbench. It was discolored, and on closer inspection, I realized that it was coated in dry blood. Now, I don't know much about the slaughtering of animals, but I knew that my grandparents used to do it often. Chickens, pigs, and stuff. So I figured that the hatchet was used for that purpose, and they never cleaned it. The barn had a loft that was filled with hay, so I decided to climb the ladder and check it out. When I was shining the light around, it reflected off something buried in the hay. I was wondering if it was another tool or something and decided to check it out. Going over to it, I began moving the hay, and I screamed when the empty eye sockets of a long dead corpse were staring directly at me. I fell backwards and nearly fell off the loft. I quickly climbed down the ladder and ran out of the barn without closing the door. I rushed into the house and told my parents and grandparents about what I'd seen. My father, a huge man, like Hulk Hogan sized, went out to confirm what I told him. My grandparents phoned the sheriff's office. The body had been in the loft for about 3 years. It had several hatchet wounds on it that the police told us were caused by the hatchet I'd seen on the bench. The hatchet I picked up. So not only had I found a dead body, but I held an actual murder weapon in my hand. That was truly disturbing to me. But it wasn't nearly as disturbing as the realization my grandparents had that they had lived in the house for 3 years without knowing a dead body was in the barn. No one was ever caught, and we to this day have no idea who killed that man or why. For the purposes of this story, I wish to remain anonymous. and I'm not even going to tell you where it happened. What I will tell you is that the city it happened in has a really large Thanksgiving Day parade every year. I'd never been to one of them before, but I always watched it on TV. I went ahead and decided to go one year, and I couldn't find anyone who wanted to go with me. None of my family or friends wanted to spend Thanksgiving standing in the cold, I guess. By the time I got into the parade route, it was really, really packed, and I was worried whether or not I'd be able to see that well. I'm not that tall, but I was able to find a spot behind another group of people that gave me a pretty good view of the parade route. I hadn't been there very long when I noticed someone who, for some reason, just caught my eye. I can't say there was anything unusual about him, really. He was rather big, a little unkempt, but there was just something about him. I, in fact, found myself continuously looking over at him. A few times I was looking at the man, he caught me looking. As most people do when they're caught looking at someone, I quickly looked away each time. This guy was really weird. My curiosity got to me eventually, and I started looking in his direction again. After a while, I could tell that he was getting annoyed, and I resolved to try harder not to look at him, but that just made it worse. He was so goddamn weird. After a while, I looked at the man again and noticed that he was closer to me than he had been before. I didn't think about it at first because we were in a big crowd watching a parade. People moving around in the crowd were in no way unusual. But the more I glanced over at him, the closer and closer to me he kept moving. He was doing it casually, though, making his way around the other people. And he was definitely coming in my direction. What the fuck? To test and see what he would do, I made my own way through the crowd toward the back of the sidewalk. I glanced at him and he immediately switched course to be coming toward me. I was convinced he was coming at me, and I was mildly alarmed. However, I kept telling myself that it wasn't anything to worry about. I was at a parade with thousands of people. If the guy was going to try and hurt me, he'd get caught pretty quickly. I guess that's the problem with assumptions, though. They really don't take all possible scenarios into account. The man did make his way over. There was only one person separating us when he stopped and went back to looking at the parade. I relaxed a bit, but when the man separating us moved, the guy moved up against me. I was about to move before I felt something sharp against my back. This motherfucker had a knife. And probably because we were in a big crowd, he was able to hide the fact that he was holding it up against my back. I mean, to any bystanders, he looked like a guy in a crowd watching a parade. He asked me why I was staring at him over and over, and I was too scared to speak at first. But when he asked again and moved the knife, I apologized, telling him that I didn't mean to stare. I didn't know why I was looking at him. He told me he didn't believe me. And as if it were possible, the shit got even weirder. He asked me how much McMahon was paying me. Now, I had no idea what he was talking about or who the hell McMahon was, but he didn't believe me. He kept pushing on the knife and told me I'd better tell him the truth. I heard my voice crack, and I pleaded to the guy to leave me the hell alone and that I didn't know what he was talking about. I guess my words were somehow heard over the noise of the parade because two guys looked at us and then asked the guy what he was doing. I really thought he was just going to stab me then and there, but I guess he figured that he'd never be able to do it and then get away in this crowd. He slipped the knife away, didn't answer the two men, and took off. They didn't go after him. They just made sure I was all right. To this day, I have no idea who McMahon was, but it doesn't matter. I can tell you this, though. I've been a hell of a lot more careful about not staring at people. You're listening to the Blackwater Media Radio Network, the finest in digital audio entertainment. This is Blackwater Media coming to you from the great city of Atlanta. I come from a very good upbringing. My family had it very good, and I never really had to be without anything. I try to give back as much as possible. I donate a lot of money to the poor and things like that. One of the things that I'm the proudest of is that on Thanksgiving, I volunteer my entire day at a local homeless shelter. I try to make sure that these much less fortunate people have a good day as possible for them. I stay in the shelter overnight and leave the following morning. One of the sadder things about working in a shelter is seeing the same people there year after year. I guess seeing them makes me happy that they're not dead. But it would be nice if the majority of them were able to get themselves a place to live and not have to live on the streets anymore. The Thanksgiving 10 years ago is one that I'll never forget. There's not a lot of build-up to the story, so I'll get right to it. The day and evening went as well as it could. There was this one guy that I'd never seen before. Normally, I wouldn't have even thought much about that. But he was very annoying and very rude. At one point, he even tried to take the food away from another man. Now, the rules of the shelter were that I was supposed to remove the man from the shelter for such an act. However, I couldn't bring myself to do that, not on Thanksgiving. I instead separated the two men and let the guy know that any further aggressive behavior would result in him being removed. The rest of the day and night went fine, as far as I was aware. However, at about 3 a.m, one of the other homeless guys came into the office. He told me that one of the other men had been stabbed. I ran out into the area, and sure enough, the man who nearly had his food stolen had been stabbed, and he was dead. I turned on the lights and searched around for the rude guy from dinner, and he wasn't there. I checked the bathroom, and the window was open. He had killed the one man and then left as quietly as he could. The most horrific part of this was a man losing his life over something as simple as a dinner. Even worse for me was that the man would likely still be alive if I'd followed the rules and removed the man during dinner instead of letting him remain because it was Thanksgiving. A few years ago, I was at my parents' home for a family dinner on Thanksgiving Day. This is the house I grew up in and have never experienced anything paranormal. What happened to me that day was very surprising and still bothers me to this day. I spent the early part of the day helping my mother in the kitchen preparing dinner. We were laughing and talking and looking forward to sitting down to eat with the whole family. While making pumpkin pies, my mother needed a break from the heat of the kitchen and went into the living room to watch the Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade. I stayed in the kitchen and continued to work. While making the pies, I needed to go to the pantry to get some ingredients. The pantry is located down a short hallway connecting the kitchen with the back of the house. I grabbed the items I needed and headed back to the kitchen. I was almost back to the kitchen when I remembered that I forgot to grab something and quickly pivoted around to head back to the pantry. To my shock, there was a man standing near the area I just was in. It must have been 2 or 3 seconds, even though it felt like forever, and then he was gone. I've never seen this man before, but I can remember he was wearing overalls and a hat. The most disturbing thing for me was it seemed as though he reacted to me. It was like he was either shocked that I saw him, or he was shocked to see me. After seeing this man, I decided not to tell my mother or father. It wasn't until months later I finally felt comfortable enough to tell my mom about it. She was interested, but said she never had anything unusual happen to her in the 35 years she lived in the house. I know what I saw. I know he was there. My question is, why? Who is he? Why did I see him? In my 28 years of living and visiting my childhood home at Thanksgiving brought back so many great memories. But the 2 to 3 seconds on that Thanksgiving day seems to be burned into my mind more than anything else I've experienced in that house. On Thanksgiving Day 1902, a southbound train was nearing Geneva, New York, and came upon the Marsh Bridge. As the train approached the bridge, the engineer and firemen on board heard a piercing scream. When they looked up, they saw a white figure standing to the east of the bridge, frantically waving its arms. The engineer brought the train to a stop, and as he did so, they heard another scream, and the phantom disappeared before their eyes. The two men got out of the train and inspected the track and surrounding area for the screaming weirdo they saw just moments before. Nothing was out of place on the track, and there was no sign of any person or thing nearby. As they started across the bridge, they heard the shriek one final time. The train pulled into the station, and as happens in such circumstances, the men shared their odd experience with the other railroad workers. They learned that there was an accident at that bridge years prior. The engineer and fireman both died when the train went off the Marsh Bridge. The article that they read stated that the fireman's body was lost to quicksand and never recovered. Ever since that accident, a shrieking phantom is said to be spotted on this bridge every year on or near Thanksgiving. As Americans gather for the Thanksgiving holiday, it is perhaps time to turn the clock back to one family feast that did not raise quite as much cheer. It tells of the terrible incidents that took place in a house in Oakville, Georgia, USA, in the latter part of the 19th century. This spot had earned a high place amongst haunted localities, and in its day was comparable with the famous house in Berkeley Square. Situated in the midst of picturesque but lonely country, this house, the property of a farmer named Walsingham, had a worldwide reputation amongst paranormal researchers. For some time, the house had been left deserted by its owner, and it would seem that during the temporary absence of its material master, it passed into the hands of beings or forces, call them what you will, who wished to remain in undisputed possession. When Walsingham and his family decided to return and take up their abode in the house, they were struck on the very first day by the peculiar feeling of the place. They could not decide in any way what this feeling was, but on analysis likened it to claustrophobia, an overpowering dread of being alone within any four walls. Their dog, Don Caesar, absolutely refused to enter the house. On being dragged in, he immediately broke out into furious barking. His back bristled with rage, and he showed every sign of terror. This occurred several times during the day, and the same evening, being attracted to the spot by his whines and howls, Walsingham saw his dog attacking some invisible enemy. Don Caesar at last sprang into the air as if at a man's throat, but fell back as if he had received a heavy blow. When picked up, his neck was found to be broken. The Walsingham's cat, on the other hand, manifested every sign of delight at being in the house. It strolled from room to room, purring loudly, and was seen on several occasions twisting its head from side to side and arching its back as if someone were stroking it. To say that the Walsinghams were amazed at these things would be to describe their feelings mildly. They were very much upset, but had not as yet any suspicion on the score of supernatural causes. But that evening, just towards dusk, the house was suddenly filled with shouts, groans, and hideous laughter, heard by all the occupants, and putting them into a veritable panic. Miss Amelia Walsingham, while sitting in front of her mirror, saw a man's hand upon her shoulder, yet there was no reflection of it in the glass, nor was there any arm or body apparent. Walsingham himself saw footprints forming in the dust of a garden path before him as he walked, yet no mortal could be seen. But though these things were uncanny and terrifying, and were sufficient to make the family realize that some force out of the usual was at work, they paled into insignificance before the later incidents which took place during the evening meal. The family was seated at supper with one or two guests when their conversation was suddenly interrupted by a loud and horrible groan, uttered apparently in the room above. Little notice was taken of it until one of the guests pointed out a stain of what looked like blood on the tablecloth, and it was then seen that some liquid was slowly dripping from the ceiling overhead. This liquid was so much like freshly shed blood as to horrify those who witnessed its slow dripping. It would be hard to imagine a more gruesome occurrence at any time, but the peculiar form of this horror, and the theatrical way in which it was carried out, would put it down as the invention of some most evil-minded but decidedly clever person. It flashed into the minds of all sitting at the table that some terrible deed had been committed in the room above, some frightful murder. For a few seconds all sat silent with white faces, looking out of the corners of their eyes at each other in terror. Then Walsingham shook off the paralysis of fear and ran out of the room, followed by his son. They went quickly upstairs to the room over the dining room and flung open the door, dreading what fearful sight their eyes should meet. But it was empty. They tore up the carpet, and there found the boards to be soaked with the same red, gruesome liquid as was dripping in the room beneath. But there was no explanation, nor was any afterwards discovered. The liquid was later examined under a microscope by a medical man and pronounced to be human blood. This incident was too much for the Walsinghams, and they left the house and removed to another. Walsingham House then fell into entire disuse, and stories of the occurrences being put abroad, the place was shunned by day as well as by night. This neglect did not tend to make the spot look more cheerful, and it is stated that in addition to the gloom that generally settles on the most ordinary of empty houses, there was an undoubted feeling of depression in the air around the place. Quite normal people said that it felt to them as if the atmosphere of the locality weighed more than anywhere else. The house had not yet been approached for several months when a young man named Horace Gunn made it the subject of a wager, betting a friend a fair sum of money that he would stay alone in the house for one night and have no aid within call. This enthusiastic young man carried out his intention and went to the house one evening before it was dark. His story is best told in his own words. I had been in the house about an hour and nothing had happened. It was just beginning to get dark, and I thought I would set about lighting a fire. Though I do not consider myself an expert in this art, I was very much surprised at being absolutely unable to do so. My matches went out one after the other, as if blown out by a strong draft. Once, when I succeeded in lighting a piece of paper, it only smoldered for a few seconds and then went out. This was bad enough, as I had to give up the idea of a cheerful blaze to keep me company. But to my disgust, I found that my lamp would not light either. It was as if it were filled with water instead of with oil. It was now quite dark, and whilst I was looking about for some means of getting a light, there came a terrible yell of pain from underneath the house. And this was the signal for an outbreak of the most hideous and devilish noises. There were shouts, screams, groans, laughter, thumping, and the continual running up and down stairs as of several heavily shod people. My hair bristled. I stood by the window, practically paralyzed with fear, and had I been then able to control my limbs, I would have fled from the house. I would have lost my wager and 100 like it rather than stay in that haunt of fiends. Then, suddenly the noises stopped. Complete silence fell on the place. But far from reassuring me, this made matters worse, for now I dreaded the silence even more than I had the ghostly noises. All the time I listened for something. Now and then I thought I heard the soft footsteps drawing near me, but it was nothing. This waiting and dreading was far worse than the pandemonium of terror. I did not have long to wait for the next move, for in the darkness there suddenly appeared a small spot of grayish light on the wall opposite me. It grew larger and larger, altering in shape, until it assumed the outline of a human head, at the same time losing its flatness. Soon it was a real head floating in the air. Its hair was long and gray and matted together, and it had a deep and jagged cut in one temple. The whole face indicated suffering and misery. The eyes were wide open and gleamed with an unearthly fire, while they seemed to direct their gaze upon me. The head moved about the room, but always the eyes turned in my direction. Then it vanished, but there broke out in the room a loud and awe-inspiring wail, as of several souls in anguish. I thought then that I could see indistinct shapes flitting about, and mustering up all my courage, I attempted to pass them and gain the door. But just as I reached it, I felt my ankle seized in a firm grasp. I was thrown down and felt fingers grasping at my throat. At this point, Mr. Gunn's story ceases. He was found by his friends next morning, unconscious on the floor by the door, and bearing on his throat the marks of long, thin fingers with cruel, curved nails. After this experience, no one was found to have anything more to do with the house, though a few people interested in such matters attempted to find out some reason for this terrible haunting. Though several avenues of investigation were explored, nothing very conclusive was discovered. The house had by this time acquired such an evil reputation that no one would occupy it, and it was ultimately demolished. Many human bones were found under it and in its grounds. How they came there was never known, but it was supposed that they had lain there for many years and were the bones of people who might have been murdered when the house was a roadside inn of very bad repute. And herein perhaps lies an explanation for the hauntings at the house. A few days before returning to his house, Mr. Walsingham, having discovered in the ground some old, dried bones, and not able to decide whether they were human or not, settled the matter as he thought by ordering them to be thrown into a lime kiln. Is it possible that the spirits of the men whose bones were thus so indecently treated summoned to their aid certain dark forces in order to make the place uninhabitable by mortals in revenge for the insult offered to their remains? The answer may never be known.